One of the most important elements that can make or break an anime is its soundtrack, which can elevate the emotion and depth of the storytelling and transport us to a whole new world. Here are your nominees for Best OST of 2022.
いってらっしゃい。行ってきます。このままじゃ嫌だ。おいらどうしたら
影山君には大事なことを教えてもらった。
バイク。
そこにあなたが雪村葵さん。はい、このパターンは
The jury winner is Chainsaw Man.
And the public winner is Bochi the Rock.
Joining me to talk about soundtracks is none other than the anime music podcast AMP, which are two people.
Nope, I'm Shabu. I'm a professional music director and composer for almost a decade now.
I'm Core. I'm a musician, and I like talking about music a lot.
They're both music nerds, but Shabu is that music nerd.
Oh my god.
And joining us from the jury is Dark Heart Cat.
Hello.
So OST, a lot to talk about here, and I'm actually really happy that we have both Core and Shabu here because it's so different hearing exactly from the mouths of people who actually compose and score and make this stuff. How important an OST can be, because unfortunately sometimes it can kind of be put to the side or in the background, something you don't really pay attention to, but it's so important to enjoying all the shows we love. So instead of diving right in to talk about our winners, I want to ask a kind of general question, which is, a lot of the times people consider an OST in more simplistic terms, right? So, oh, if there's a cool fight scene or if it's a climactic moment, just play the opening and it'll be cool. Or if it's a really sad scene, just stick some piano on. But I find a lot of the time the OST itself can be used as a storytelling device to progress narratives and themes and character arcs. Can you guys kind of expand on that and elucidate for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it almost becomes like a character in and of itself a lot of the time. I think one thing that made like the original Made in Abyss and honestly the second season as well stand out so much is that it becomes its own part of the world, right? It is part of the world building. I think Bochi the Rock does something similar. If you listen, it's very close, like it's mixed very close. A lot of the instruments are pretty kind of like more center leaning in terms of panning, and then also mixed like close, so there's less reverb and stuff like that. And then there's a lot less instrumentation, so it's kind of more sparse, and that leads to a kind of more intimate feeling, right? And that's a buddy feeling that you get from the show, and it's also mirrored in the actual music and the creation of the music and what instruments you pick, how you mix them, and it permeates the entire music creation process.
And the way that you use the music can tell a lot about the story through context. Say if you have like a melodic passage that represents a certain character, if you play that in a certain scene that might not even have the character but be related to the character, you can tell the audience directly that this is about this person or this is related. You should connect these dots. So it's a very effective way to cross that gap and tell you information without having to literally explain it to you. Or even something like Cyberpunk Edge Runners, which uses that song "I Really Want to Be Your House." I think that's the title, anyways. But like the way it changes with the context affects like the emotional effect through how we interpret it in the story.
Yeah, it's
Darkheart, would you?
oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. Darkheart, would you say that that was one of the discussions, or as part of the discussion when you were trying to rank these entries?
Yeah, I would say that. For the OST, a lot of the times, like you said, it can be a sort of cheat code for emotion where sad thing happens, so we will now play sad music. And a lot of the times when we talk about music, we often talk about it in relationship to the visual or even the story, how it underlines certain visual aspects. But what some of the most interesting nominees did this year was how it draws out some connections that are not so explicit in either visual or the audio elements.
And speaking of Cyberpunk that we just mentioned, I believe that obviously it's so tied into the game, and when we were watching it with my friend, who I haven't played Cyberpunk, but almost it seemed like every other second he was like pointing out like, "Oh my god, I recognize that street corner." Oh my god, um, I believe that the OST used some tracks from the game as well. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. They're from a radio station channel that you can hear when you're driving around.
Which I think is a really interesting and example. I mean, it's something I feel like is especially common in more modern media where we see a lot of movies using like popular songs and like finding the context to make those pieces of music work effectively in the story. But I think it's especially interesting with Cyberpunk because it's music that was created sort of within the world of the game, which adds this extra element, but then the ways they find to fit it in and make it work within the show. It's a very unique soundtrack in that sense, since a lot of these other soundtracks are primarily music that was composed originally, whereas this is taking music that was prior made before and then using it in interesting ways. So it's a very
And yet,
different kind of thing to tackle.
it fits so perfectly that it feels like it was almost tailor made for the. Because if you think, I mean, like a lot of the whole of Cyberpunk Edge Runners is the relationship between David and Lucy, right? And just that song and the way that they show it really feels like it was made for them. Which was all the more shocking when Imaishi did a AMA a little while back on the Edge Runners subreddit, and he was talking about how he was going through the radio music lineup for Cyberpunk 2077, and that song just like rung out to him, and he knew he had to use it in some way. I think he used it fantastically.
I think it's great. I think that a distinction to make, this is just me being pedantic, but um like the thing that makes Cyberpunk's OST so good is less the OST. The OST is great, but the music direction is actually what makes it stand out, and
Could
like
you
the music selection and stuff like that.
could you elucidate the difference between the two? And just for the audience, by
Right.
the way, when we judge OST for these awards, we do take into account both the quality of the soundtrack standalone as well as its usage in the show.
Right. So music direction is basically music choice and placement. Um, there can also be other parts of it. It works very closely with music editing. And in one job that I've done, I've actually done kind of both. Like I'll make a mock-up doing editing, and then like the edges will be kind of sanded down. Um, but it's basically you have a library of music, right? And you curate that in one way or another, and then you choose those tracks to fit somewhere. You still have to spot, um, and spotting is when you watch something or you storyboard something, and you basically map out the times, and you decide, okay, this is going to be like Q1 or whatever. And for an example, this is getting a little bit deep into the weeds. I apologize. But if you had like episode one, you would say 1M1 would be like episode one, scene one, right? And usually that's like for films, that's reels. So like 1M1, 2M1, different reels. But for shows, I like to do it by episodes. Like 1M1, 2M1 would be episode two, scene one, and so on. And basically, you decide what time cues stuff goes into, how it fades out, what parts of the track you're going to use, because you're not always going to go from the beginning and go from the end. Sometimes you have to decide like when something needs to be cut in the middle. And something that I actually really like about another one of the nominees, which is Made in Abyss season 2, which I really loved in terms of like growth from the first season to the second season, is actually writing music for this concept. So like writing music to be edited and writing it in such a way that there's more repetition or more moments of silence or something like that. So it's more easily aided in letting the director, in a lot of anime's cases, I think the director will also handle music direction, allowing them to kind of choose what parts of a piece might be used and allow them a lot more freedom. I think it's a really really cool thing that composers are doing more.
And with something like that too, it's with music direction and editing, it's something that I feel like is really important to appreciate, because even an incredible soundtrack, if there's poor music direction and editing, or if it's a case where the music is really good but it's not very malleable, that can end up having an overall not very good soundtrack, music that doesn't fit the scene very well or doesn't match the timing or the tone to the in the way that it needs to. So it's like very much a back and forth relationship where they need to, fit together tightly. I'd say especially for example for something like a comedy anime like Boshi the Rock, like the timing and placement of the music and the way it functions with the jokes is going to be something really important to get right. Otherwise, things aren't going to land as well as they could.
It's so interesting thinking about the interplay between kind of the showrunner and the composer, because sometimes you think of you think a scene is made first, and then kind of the composer is tasked with the duty of matching something to it rather than the other way around, which seems to be the trend, as you've stated.
Yeah. Generally with anime series, it's more common for the soundtrack to be comprised of a bunch of tracks that can be slotted in to various episodes rather than what we see with primarily with like movies, for example, where they're scored. So the music is written after the picture is finished to match with the picture itself.
It's not always the case. I think I was being told actually like right before we were recording that Yamano Susume was scored, right?
Yeah, but that's because Yamano Susume's anime was made like years in advance of its actual release.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is super interesting because I remember when Cora and I were listening through Yamano Susume. I haven't watched the show myself, so I can't really speak on the music direction or anything like that. But when we were listening through it, it has some moments where I was like, wow, this doesn't like exactly resolve the way that I would think it would, or the structure is a bit like terse or something like that. And when you said, "Oh, it's scored," I'm like, "Oh, that makes sense." Scored music usually turns out to be much less, well, musical, like song like. So like it doesn't slot as well into the 3 minute kind of structures where it moves very nice and easily. A lot of times during scoring, like for example, I'll have a cue that's going for like a minute and a half, and I've got another minute left, and action happens, and I need to just like bump up the tempo by like 10 BPM. It's just like just enough that the audience won't notice it, but enough that it'll actually match, like the beats will match the scene and stuff like that. And when you're listening back, it can sound a little bit wonky. Um, And so, stuff like that is interesting from a scored perspective or OST perspective versus like listening to an OST on its own as its own music. Um, it really shows an interesting dichotomy. And obviously both are amazing. I like both approaches, but it's a lot of it has to do with time and budget.
Now, I'm sure when you were both listening to these OSTs, because you've listened through most of them or all of them, I'm sure you had a kind of like image of the ranking in your head, right? Oh, this is probably a public favorite. Oh, I think the jury's gonna like this. Do these rankings fit with what you might have originally imagined? And if not, what were the surprises?
I mean, I'd say the main two at the top make a lot of sense. Chainsaw Man is a really well produced soundtrack, and it has a lot of interesting textures and just a lot of very interesting things going on musically. So I can see why the jury would pick that. And Boshu the Rock obviously is an anime series with a focus on music, so it makes sense to me that it will end up being the public pick just because if the subject matter is music, you're naturally going to mentally take note of that happening a lot more, and so it's going to leave a stronger impression. So it makes sense that you might be more inclined to pick that as your favorite for the soundtrack for this category. The big thing that surprises me, and I would imagine my friend Shabu as well, is how low Made in Abyss Season 2 is ranked here on the jury's side.
Yeah, I felt that something to be lauded was Penkin's kind of this feels weird to say because he's so much better of a composer than I am. Um, but like growth from season 1 to season 2, um, and especially in some of that more like mature tone as a composer, I feel like there's a lot more, or not more maturity. There's a lot of maturity in the writing of season 2, and a lot more of the written in a way that's very easily malleable and usable. And I thought that was interesting. I was curious if the jury would take that into account, but I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, Duckhard, if you would illuminate exactly what the discussion around Made in Abyss Season 2 was and how the other entries above it beat it out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So Maiden Abyss at 6th, it looks low, but um, from like 1 to like 7, I'd say they're all really close, and we were really nitpicking like little weaknesses we thought the soundtracks had to try and have an idea of where we wanted to rank things.
Something not listed on here that I would encourage people to just look at for music direction would be like the first episode of Summertime Render or Summertime Rendering. Really intelligent and interesting music direction. Like if you're looking for music direction in particular, not like so much the score or anything like that. The first episode of Summertime Rendering is really fascinating as like a case study.
What I wanted to ask you both as well is just in regards to how much of the composer you can hear in a work, right? So we're obviously mentioned Penkin's name a lot. Kevin Penkin is
Mhm.
the person who behind the soundtrack for Main Abyss Season 2. Just exactly, what would you say characterizes what it means to be like Penkin-esque?
He really
Hello.
likes certain chord progressions, but also the way that he orchestrates is very consistent. Um, it's hard for me to explain. I'd probably have an easier time explaining Ushio's work on Chainsaw Man because it's more similar to something I would write, I think. And like you only have to look so far as Liz and the Bluebird to Chainsaw Man, and especially some of the more reserved and pulled back tracks in Chainsaw Man to see some through lines of how he uses these kind of plunky textures, these really kind of muted textures of in Liz and the Bluebird, the prepared piano, and then in Chainsaw Man, some of these synths or other nice little muted plonky textures.
Core, any thoughts?
I guess I'd say in terms of like going back to uh Pankins like musical like notes, I'd say one big thing, particularly with Made in Abyss, is the space in which it's recorded. Um, it's very distinct in the way you can hear the placement of all the instruments and how the sounds are interacting with each other in a way that I don't find is generally very noticeable in a lot of other scores. And there's also a very clear way that the musical instruments interplay in a very environmental and aesthetic manner, more so than in a clear function of melodical progression. So you get a lot of little passages that have more environmental or like chirpy sounds that give that sense of the world that the characters are in, um, and less the sense of just some straightforward melody that you might find yourself humming. Though there are those as well.
Which, I suppose that, Made in Abyss is obviously known for its world building, and I believe that was probably a major factor for the jury in their discussion. Doc would you mind talking about exactly what you were discussing in regards to the Made in Abyss OST and exactly why some of the other entries ranked above it?
Yeah, one of the main flaws we thought Made in Abyss had was some mixing issues, and how sometimes it would cut out abruptly. Sometimes there would be instrumental layers that didn't really make any sense to be there. Some of the vocal tracks as well didn't feel particularly well integrated within the rest of the OST. But yeah, those are really minor nitpicks, and it's quite a good OST.
Is this one of the situations where like numbers 1 through like 7, like you pretty much rearrange them and get like a pretty close uh facsimile of your ranking? Like it was kind of a real toss up.
Yeah, there was really no consensus as to which one was the best, but yeah.
Now, what I want to pivot to is and this I have to admit this is kind of selfish because the last time, I'm not a very like I'm not very knowledgeable about the world of music and stuff, right? So I kind of latch on to names that I recognize, and Kensuke Ushio is obviously the Listen the Bluebird kind of phenom that everyone gushed about when that came out because of like the kind of cool art housey stuff he did with Yamada, where they like went to a classroom and they like pushed desks around and used the little squeaks and blah blah blah. Is there any of that elements recurring or showing back up in Chainsaw Man, or is it kind of a more traditional OST compared to something like Liz and the Bluebird?
Yeah, absolutely. Chainsaw Man definitely has those elements, and one of its biggest strengths is the patience it has to just not accompany any of its scenes with music. And what ends up happening is like two things end up happening. The first is you have this negative space where it sets up comedic moments quite well. And in the episode where Power wanted Denji to help her find her cat, the music would just suddenly come in, and that was quite strong. And another thing that ends up happening when you have all this silence is it's never really just silence. You hear the city, you hear the noise of the city a lot more. Like you hear helicopter sounds, you hear alarms blaring, and the relevance of this is that in the actual tracks itself, it samples some of these elements, so that you have this basically a neutral background from which tracks can basically evolve out of that. And we thought those transitions were particularly strong.
I love pointing out the usage of silence or the usage of just like diegetic sound. Um and the restraint of like not using something, because that's something that I think about a lot. I think one of my first music teachers said sometimes it's more about what you don't say rather than what you do. And it's like a conversation. You can't be talking all the time. Like sometimes you have to leave silence or leave gaps between words. You're not just talking at someone all the time. And so I like that you guys took that into account. I think that's really good.
And I have to say to that.
What?
Okay. Just to round out the category, because we could be talking about this all day, and it's just a testament to exactly how wonderful these soundtracks are that we can spend so long talking about them. Because I'm pretty sure we've talked about like 3 shows for this entire segment, and it's been like, I mean,
Yeah.
to you the viewer, it hasn't been that long, but to us, it's just more on top of more on top of more. So here's kind of an interesting thing I want to try, which could bomb. Would you mind going through each entry and just kind of like summing up the soundtrack in either one word or one sentence?
Okay.
And you
Give
can
me a
go.
sec to think
Who do you
about it.
want? Who do you want to do
you,
that?
you guys can go all in a turn.
All right.
Okay, so we'll do Darkheart. And we'll do from. I guess we'll just do it from the jury side to make it easier.
Yeah, okay.
So Chainsaw Man.
Chainsaw Man. I'm gonna go with realism.
Okay, wait, very fitting. Shabu.
Restraint.
Core.
Texture.
Cyberpunk. Darkheart.
Inserts.
I'll say it. Say it again.
Inserts.
Inserts.
Okay,
And I can do a sentence.
sure.
Clever music direction and almost diegetic feeling.
Core.
Use of music for tone.
Maybe this will take too long.
Yeah.
It was
yeah.
worth a shot.
It was a good idea. Well,
It's
Yeah.
it's
Good
just
concept.
it's so hard to get through everything. Like I want to
Yeah.
talk about everything. Like, it's fun. But
Well, that's
I
why there's
talk too
winners and
much.
there's losers.
one last thing I want to mention before we leave is that as is the case with a lot of these categories, you end up comparing pretty wildly different entries, right? So it's got to be hard comparing something like Bochi the Rock, which is like comedy slice of life, with something like Cyberpunk, with something like a Kebi sailor uniform, right? How exactly do you compare a soundtrack that maybe has wildly different elements to it?
Yeah.
I think at the
Oh no, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. I think at the end of the day, the important thing is looking at it in context. How well does the music work to execute what's being intended? It's like just looking at things in context and to what heights does the music push it? Is it simply effective, or is the music actively making all the other elements of the show better?
Yeah, how perfectly does the music serve its role? Which is going to be different in each show, obviously. But some shows it's going to be bombastic and very forward facing, and some shows it's going to be a lot more reserved and in the background, really just kind of manipulating the scene from behind.
Yeah. The question of how do we rank soundtracks that have widely different intentions was a question that we ended up asking ourselves a lot over the period of our discussions. And ultimately, there's not really one answer, because how can you compare something like Yamano Susume and like Cyberpunk when they have so few similarities? And yeah.
But ultimately, I think it is exactly what Core and Shabu were stating, right? Where it's kind of a mix of exactly how did this work for the show? How did it elevate it above, not having music at all, or just having stock music, right? Or in addition to that, how technically impressive it may be, right? How creative, how hard. Were that all was that were all of those elements something you took into account as a jury?
The soundtrack as itself and its technicality wasn't something we placed we didn't place a lot of emphasis on that. it was mostly on the usage side. And yeah, as far as intentions go, I think I can pretty confidently say that the top like seven shows all pretty much nailed their intention and was really hard to rank.
All right, you heard it. If you are into music, if you are into simply good direction in general, you should check out any one of these shows. It'll be an option. Thank you guys so much for joining me. This has been Core and Shabu of the Anime Music Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You can check them out on YouTube, AMP, Anime Music Podcast. I'm waiting for the next episode. And I hope you guys have a great day.